because she's got great experience across different countries on family businesses. So Kripa, if I can start with you uh, by asking how in how have you seen families deal with COVID? And let me just quickly tell you very briefly what I have seen here.
Mhm.
You know, I think this is probably the first time ever in the last certainly 100 years when family, especially business families, have spent so much of quality time together. You know, no matter which part of the
Yes.
world you are in, there has been a period of strict lockdown where you couldn't even step out of the house, and the families had no choice but to be together. And this, at least here, anecdotally, what I hear, has brought about a great change in the quality of relationships between the various members of family. And I will share with you, what I have found. But I am very, very curious to hear from you. How have you seen, anecdotally, families dealing with this staying together for extended periods of time and dealing with this ghost called COVID?
Yeah, thank you for that, Sonu. And Kiran, first of all, thank you for that extremely kind introduction, and Sonu as well. I hope I can live up to your expectations. That will be my first
No
hope.
pressure,
Um,
no pressure, no pressure at all.
no, I think we're really at a point where we're coming together to discuss something that has become first in terms of priorities for a lot of families going forward. And Sonu, you've raised a really interesting point that families are now coming together under the same roof for an extended period of time. So, what effect has that had on succession planning, and what effect has that had on the relationships between patriarchs, matriarchs, and the rest of the family, essentially, as well? Um, First thing I will do is I would actually probably in this instance divide up, broadly speaking, into Western Europe and the United States, the UK, and India, Southeast Asia, broadly speaking. One of the things that you mentioned is the patriarchs and matriarchs and the rest of the families under one roof. That's something that we haven't seen as typical. We don't have the joint family system in Europe and in the States usually. So what we're seeing is actually a great deal of isolation. You have individual family units who actually haven't been able to meet for weeks and weeks, sometimes months on end, and all interaction has been through Zoom, through telephone calls, et cetera, which has actually put some distance in some cases between families and has made that intuitive decision making or consensus building a little bit more challenging, where you might come together and have lunch together, go out somewhere, something like this, and of course talk business at the same time. Those opportunities are now gone. What has been important though is time, as you mentioned. So now families have time, particularly patriarchs and matriarchs have time to perhaps step back and think about the future. And COVID has put that into very sharp focus. I will again put two caveats around the time issue. For some, it has been a time of extreme stress. Businesses have not been going well. We all know the sectors that have been hit most hard by COVID: retail, food and beverage, travel, so on and so forth. And when you're a business owner focusing on these areas, I think it's been an incredibly stressful time. What you're essentially doing is fighting fires day in and day out. People are working from home and incredibly focused on just keeping going from month to month, occasionally from week to week. And in those cases, there's been zero focus on the bigger picture, on succession, and on building family relationships. On the other hand, those patriarchs and matriarchs who have been fortunate enough to be running businesses where things are more stable from a revenue perspective, from a turnover perspective, from a staffing perspective, they have had the time to sit back and reflect. Business travel is nil, of course, and it's been a time to think about the succession plan, particularly because mortality becomes the top of everybody's mind at this point, whether we like it or not.
Yeah, yeah. It's always said that the culture plays a very important role in family businesses. And as I'm listening to you, it is just so evident because what you are describing is almost the complete opposite of what has happened to family businesses in India. Even if people have not been living together as a large joint family, the natural instinct, as soon as lockdown became imminent, was for the younger generation, the sons and daughters, along with their families, to move back to the family home so that people are together. And I do know of people who were traveling overseas, were caught in the US and UK, and as soon as they were able to charter a flight back, they came back so that everybody could be together. And this, in India at least, has given families to re-examine the relationship that they have with each other. There, as all of us who are here, and you especially know that a lot of times the communication in family suffers because it's just so easy to brush uncomfortable subjects under the carpet and get out of the house, go to the office, go wherever. Now, actually, it is not possible to brush it under the carpet because when you are together, and I am speaking from an India perspective, when you are together, there's a limit to the amount of Netflix that you can watch and the HBO that you can watch and whatever that you can do. You do sit down together, and once you sit down together, you do start talking. And again, anecdotally, because there is no empirical data yet, anecdotally, relationships have actually been able to smoothen out the corners in the 5 months that lockdown started mid March here in India. A lot of renegotiations for their places, irrespective places within the family and the business have happened. And going forward, it will only porter well for the businesses, because as soon as there is communication that is open in the family, between family members, there is that bit of easy flowing harmony, which speaks only better and better for the business. The other thing that this COVID has done is to let the patriarchs actually stare at mortality, because there have been people who say, we are immortal, we don't want to write a will, we'll go on forever and ever. But they have actually stared at mortality, because no matter how much of money you have, no matter how much of power you have, COVID has demonstrated that it can strike you when it wants to. So vis-a-vis succession planning, what has, or do you, in whatever you've seen and interacted, do you think this fear of death that they've all looked at, which has suddenly become real, has had an impact on the way that they look at succession planning?
Yes and no. I think that COVID has had, again, a dual impact on the mindset of the patriarchs and matriarchs that I've spoken to, at least the family leaders, I'll say. So on one hand, in some cases, fear has been intensely tied into specific preservation of the wealth and the business. So what do we do? And I mentioned firefighting earlier. What do we do to protect the business and to protect the wealth? And in some cases, and you'll know this very well, the entrepreneurial nature is to say, you know what? I built this business. I've been running this business. I'm in charge, and we'll do it my way, because I will carry this on my shoulders from beginning to end. And this is not the time to be discussing sharing responsibility, inclusive decision-making, consensus building, or certainly passing ownership. So that's one extreme that we've seen, where in fact the leaders have said, have shut down the discussion. And it is very much a response to business stress more than anything else, and as well as economic stress in a broader context. Now, on the other hand, there are cases where the succession planning has come more to the front, because of fears around mortality, but also a recognition of what I'll call key man risk. This is where it becomes evident that there are key individuals throughout the organization in the business and throughout the family organization, who will be essential for the future success of the business. And COVID puts that into light because of mortality fears, because you can't reach them, because you can't speak to them, because they're in another country. And therefore, the thought process, I would say, becomes around eliminating key man risk. Sony, you mentioned earlier that you've seen experiences where families are spending time under one roof and they're starting to have very positive conversations about succession and about the roles in the family. I'm delighted that you've seen that. I have seen some of that, but what I've also seen, unfortunately, through the years is when families sometimes spend extended periods of time together where there isn't a clear construct or clear agenda as such, what happens is the reinforcement of old roles. So the youngest sibling gets put in the corner, the oldest sibling is the golden child. The patriarch will let go as long as he is still in control as such. And there isn't necessarily a serious movement ahead. So when I'm talking about succession planning here, I'm really talking about something that is akin to putting the professionalization of what you organize in your business into your family. And that to many families feels, and I'll say this, many Asian families feels like anathema. Why would you do that? This is family. This is my mother, my father, my brother, my sister. How can I put some kind of professional structure around this? What that does, however, is allow for very clear transparency on how decisions are made, who has ownership and responsibility for certain things, and accountability. Which helps people sometimes move forward from the old roles that they may have had as children and parents in particular, to a different type of role and a different type of relationship. It's very difficult for any entrepreneur who's built their business to let go, and I can certainly empathize with that. But this is part of the process of letting go, which can be challenging. So I think around the fears, as I said, there's the fears around the business. So am I losing my customers? Am I going to have my suppliers in place? What's going to happen to the stock market? We've had a bear run for an extraordinary amount of time, but I think many people feel that the economic fundamentals around the world are not there to support what we're seeing. What is going to be my access to capital going forward? Am I going to be able to grow my company this year or next, even if I can tread water right now? So what implications does that have for my future wealth? Am I going to be able to sell my company? If my plan was indeed to pass on ownership, and I wanted to sell the company, divide up assets amongst children, for example, what happens to those plans? Those become on hold as well. So there's a multitude of layers of fear, unfortunately. Certainly the starting point is often mortality, but it's also a fear of inability to act. Our choices in some circumstances can become narrowed as well.
Yeah. So staying on that topic of fear, again, from what you've seen, are the fears that are being felt by the older generation different from the fears that the younger generation is going through? And in the way that you have interacted, and in your opinion, is there a different way that each generation is dealing with their fears? And again, let me set the context that, again, this is again anecdotal data that I have. The younger generation seems to be unlike, okay, so again, let me just cut to, it is when I speak to the younger generation, I have always heard that it is the older generation that is more comfortable taking risks, vis-a-vis business. And because, they are the ones who set up the business, they are the ones who built this business. most of the inheritors say that they, in the risk taking capacity, it is the older generation that wins. However, vis-a-vis dealing with COVID, uh, my experience is that it is the younger generation that is more willing to take risks and do things which may put them and the family in danger, whereas it is the older generation that is saying, hold on, let's not take this risk. So the risk taking ability of the two generations has just flipped on its head. I speak from India perspective.
Yes,
What has been
that's
your experience?
yeah, that's fascinating, Sonu, because I think from what I've seen, it's probably reversed. Typically, we've seen the older generation being more risk averse as the business is established. So, of course, the initial years of setting up the business are high risk times, and a lot of brave business decisions are made and so on. But once things get established, once a certain level of wealth is established and you're moving forward, what I've seen is that the ability to take on risk, or the desire to take on risk, is somewhat minimized. With the younger generation, I'm seeing some different challenges. And I'm going to divide up the younger generation into two groups. Because the younger generation is actually very broad at the moment. So we can talk about the next generation of leadership, which are really 40s and 50s. Those of us who are now thinking, when will I take over the business? Am I ready to take over the business? Do I have the skills right now, considering everything that has been thrown out in the last 6 months from a business and economic perspective? Do I still have the skills to be able to carry on the business? And I refer to sale of business in the past. If you're a member of the next generation of leadership and you had planned on an exit strategy, i.e. the sale of the business, and being able to take your portion and go off and do something else completely different, that door may now be closed to you, or rather that door may be very difficult to open. So this puts some perspective on the risks that portion of the next generation is willing to take. There's the other portion of the next generation, which I find very exciting. And I speak from someone in my 40s. So the next generation in their 20s and 30s, who, at least here in Europe, I would say, and in the US as well, are incredibly open to risk. That's partly because they see a lot of what the foundations of their life are and their society under implications of change. So we're talking about the long-term impact on the economy, on jobs, on the way capitalism will in fact develop. We're talking about political instability. We're talking on a very basic level for people in their 20s, access to educational opportunities. Indian students, myself included, often have a chance to travel and live abroad and study abroad and work abroad for a while. And those doors are also slightly more difficult to open at the moment. So risk becomes more interesting, and people are more willing to perhaps gravitate towards risk because they have less to lose, quite frankly. I would say between the age of people in their 20s and 30s. They're also very aware of opportunity. A lot of what COVID has done is, as we all know, raised the importance of technology in our society. Technology has become not just a nice to have, but a need to have, an incredibly important tool for business, but also for social interaction. And I think that younger generation that I mentioned, their 20s and 30s, are incredibly tuned in to the entrepreneurial opportunities that are possible through the use of technology. And they are very open and very open to risk that might come from setting up new businesses in those areas as well, which is very interesting. So what I see in summary is the older generation perhaps being slightly more risk averse, worried about that handover. That middle generation as such, the next generation of leadership, sometimes worried about their exit strategy, and also becoming slightly more risk averse. But that youngest generation as such really embracing the opportunity that might come forward as well. Because as I said, unfortunately, they may feel like they have less to lose.
Yeah. Yeah. So, whenever we talk about succession planning, according to me, there are three basic fears that both sides of the generation have. One is relevance, second is power, and the third is wealth.
Mhm.
The patriarchs have their own fears around relevance, power, and wealth, and the inheritors have their own fears around relevance, power, and wealth. Now, focusing on the third, which is the wealth, uh, again, in your opinion, have you seen the relationship with wealth change? With the people. So, what has been the relationship? Is there a new relationship that patriarchs have with wealth, and is there a new relationship that the inheritors have with wealth? We'll come to relevance and power later.
Yes, indeed. Um, so I think what you're asking, if I understand this correctly, is mm, are we moving away from taking the wealth for granted as such? Um,
Uh, that is one point. I mean,
yeah.
because one could say that it is the younger generation that takes wealth for granted and the older one doesn't. But relationship with wealth is consists of many facets. One is, do I use it? What do I use it for? Do I use it for myself? Do I want to leave it for my children? Uh, what do I want? Do I do it for public?
Mm-hmm.
Whatever exhibition? Do I
Mm-hmm.
use it to buy art and put it in a vault that nobody else sees? Do I, so different facets uh, to the relationship that one has with wealth. Uh, Taking
Mm-hmm.
for granted, according to me, could be both positive and negative,
Yeah.
because you're so comfortable with wealth that you just don't give a damn about it.
Mm-hmm.
So, in your opinion and in your interactions, have you seen and wealth is also the one of the main reasons why there is a conflict between the two generations.
Mm-hmm.
So has the relationship with wealth changed? And yes, have they stopped taking it for granted?
I would actually say that the relationship with wealth hasn't necessarily changed, but the ability to define their relationship with wealth has potentially arrived with the opportunity to spend more time at home. Actually, coming back to the second
Yeah.
positive aspect of this crisis, for those business owners who are not unduly stressed about the future of their business, we've talked about the fact that they've had time to reflect on the current situation and the future, and for the first time possibly define what their relationship with wealth has been. You mentioned lots of different facets, uh, and the starting point is really, what am I going to do with the wealth? What is the purpose of the wealth for me as an individual, and also for my family at large? What would I like my family to make use of in terms of the wealth? And this could be a number of different things. Wealth can be a platform to make more wealth. Wealth can be a platform for philanthropy. It can be a platform for the enjoyment of life, and so on and so forth. And I'm certainly not in the business of making judgments on how one chooses to use their wealth. But the most important thing, I think, is actually taking the time to define that relationship, which not that many people necessarily tend to do. We all get caught up in the day to day, and we become very busy with that. Once we define the purpose and the relationship we have with wealth, the purpose it has for us, we can also then pass those lessons on to the next generation, which is an interesting opportunity. Um, it opens the door to teaching about the value of money, what we want the legacy to be, whether it's an entrepreneurial legacy, a philanthropic legacy. It gives us the opportunity then to teach more actively about financial vulnerabilities to the next generation in a very real way, because then perhaps it's also an opportunity um, uh, to open the books as such, to talk about the financial statements, to talk about the health of the business in a very real sense. And it also gives us an opportunity to talk about the seed of entrepreneurialism in the family, where it comes from and where it can be built up for the next generation as well. So I would reframe that slightly in terms of taking the time to try and define the purpose of wealth for each of us.
Yeah, yeah. So wealth also, besides the family wealth and seen in the context of family businesses, if there is any conflict in the family, whether or not because of wealth, the negative impact is always on the business, and therefore there are a variety of steps that families, businesses, the patriarchs take to safeguard their wealth, or to put the business and the wealth in separate buckets, and kind of insulate one from the other. This morning in the newspaper, there was this, news that the largest business family in India, the Ambanis, the patriarch, Mukesh Ambani is now the patriarch. He set up a family council, and he's looking at a platform or a vehicle which is going to protect the family wealth and insulate the business from fights within the family. And for me, it is something which is really good, because if everybody does look up and aspires to be an Ambani, if he is safeguarding the business from the conflict that could happen between the siblings 10 years later, I think the others are going to follow suit as well. So in Europe, in America, have you seen more patriarchs taking steps to safeguard the businesses from conflict, from or to safeguard the business from the next generation themselves?
Well, hopefully it's not safeguarding it from the next generation, but absolutely. And I think the US particularly has some great examples here, although you can find them around the world, including in Asia, including in India. And this comes back to what I refer to as professionalization, in a sense. It's taking the concept of governance and putting it into the family structure. Conflict is part of human nature. Just as joy is part of human nature, conflict is also part of human nature. And the way we control conflict is to have rules and processes, measurements and outcomes. And this is really what governance is about. So when I hear that Mr. Ambani has put together a family council, what that means to me is the first step in setting up a family governance structure, which will include a family council, which then means defining certain positions and responsibilities and roles for family members, giving them accountability around that, having expectations that they will be well informed and participative, perhaps having a rule around consensus building. So for example, a family that I worked with for some time, this is a very large family, going into their 8th generation, very extensive business owning. They had a rule that no decision would be made unless it was made by consensus. That's extremely difficult when you have different branches of the family that have to come together. Really tough. And sometimes these decisions can take years, but that was the commitment of that particular family. Now, what's important is not that every decision should be based on consensus. It can be based on votes. It can be based on the patriarch making a decision. What is important is that there's clarity on what those rules are, and there's consistency around what those rules are, so everybody can play by those rules and work towards certain outcomes. Those kind of rules and clear responsibilities, and also clear understanding of how you can become a family leader, I think helps to minimize conflict, just as it does in a business. When you start a job, you understand what your job is, you understand what the expectations are, you understand what you need to do to get promoted as well. And you have a sense of ownership around that. So it's bringing governance into the family that I think is essential to reduce the possibility of family conflict. And one more thing that I'll add that I think is actually crucial to reducing the possibility of family conflict is something that I alluded to before, is an exit strategy. I think an exit strategy is incredibly important. It is it's not that common in Asian families, I'll say. It's not that common in families, period, where there's a pride around the business. But if you give people a way to leave the business if they wish, um, that removes the pressure of having to make decisions that are not necessarily your own. One thing I've also found in some of the families that I've worked with is that when there is an exit strategy, people are actually less likely to leave, which is an interesting outcome.
Yeah, yeah. So, you know, you're a professional that works with family offices and families and, you know, helps them define maybe the family governance strategies and the constitution, etc. You did say that you worked with a family that said that we will take decisions only by consensus.
Mm-hmm.
Now, take, you could have decisions by consensus, but as a professional, would you advise uh, people to follow this really strict rule that everything has to be by consensus? Because, you know, would the
Yep.
quality of decisioning be diluted because everybody has to agree? So, you know, when as a professional
Mm-hmm.
you do see the pitfalls,
Mm-hmm.
how do you guide the families? And, you know, what is the
Yeah.
advice that you would give some families who maybe are listening in now or may listen to you a little
Mm-hmm.
later? Uh,
Yeah.
how to look at the process of decisioning?
Sure.
Should it be? Yeah.
I worked for some time in an organization where we identified best practices around a lot of issues touching on family governance. But the biggest takeaway we always had with every family is that every family is unique. So, in a sense, it's not a question of best practice. It's more about outlining, for me, a series of different practices, a series of different methodologies, and each family has to come to what they feel is going to work for them. So when a family really feels that consensus making is important for them, for the well-being of their family, for reaching the purpose of their wealth, then by all means go for it. It may or may not come to the best outcomes, as you said. It may dilute the quality of the decision making. It may not. It depends on so many other factors within the family. Now, it may be that the family says, we have all the faith in the patriarch and we want him to continue from now till whenever he is able to. And if the family is comfortable with that, then that's the route that they should go to. So it is much more around aligning the different practices and helping the family choose what options there may be, including devising a voting structure and so on and so forth, and perhaps different leadership roles that revolve over years, um, fixed terms for certain boards, and bringing in outsiders. There's a various range of combinations that can be put into place, and I think that's important to consider. So one thing I'd always be hesitant to do is to say that this is the golden ticket, this is the magic answer. It's never that easy, because each family is indeed unique.
Yeah. So, you know, corporate governance has become a buzzword, and it's
Mm-hmm.
the regulators around the world are focusing a lot on corporate governance. Um, from the point of view of corporate governance, succession planning is among the top five features that the people who are responsible for corporate governance need to look at. They could be a board of
Mm-hmm.
directors, a board of advisors, it could be the family council per se. Um, do you think, in your opinion, what is the role that the external professionals or the external experts, what is the role that they can play in facilitating succession, whether through the board, whether through
Mm-hmm.
advisory, or just working as consultants with families?
Mm-hmm. I think the role of bringing in an external professional is incredibly important, actually, for a number of different reasons. One is very obvious: the experience and the insights that they may bring, the objectivity that they may bring to the table, assuming they're not the right hand man of the existing patriarch or matriarch as such. Um, but also the ability to place a certain set of responsibilities on an external professional can facilitate stronger family relationships as well. I'll give you an example of a family that had set up a family office to run the wealth that had been separated out from the business. So we talked about separating out the business, some wealth, private wealth away from the business. And this is not an unusual story to you, Sonu, but one of the family members was directed with running the family office, essentially managing those investments. They didn't go very well for a variety of reasons. And there was losses, significant losses that may or may not have been mitigated through the use of external experience. But the main loss wasn't necessarily the money. I think the most detrimental impact was that this family member essentially became the scapegoat for the decisions that the family office had made. And therefore, a relationship had been damaged pretty much irreparably. In the case of a professional, if certain goals are set, they are not met, you shake hands and you part ways. No hard feelings, it's all understood. When a family member doesn't meet expectations, how do you have that conversation? You can't fire a family member as such. You can ask them to leave that role, certainly, but how do you manage the outcomes there? And therefore, I think in maintaining the wealth, there's a very, very strong role for external professionals to play. As I said, in terms of objectivity, in terms of experience that they bring to the table, and definitely in terms of accountability and responsibility as well.
Yeah. When you did say that if there is an external consultant or an expert, you can just shake hands and tell them to go their way, no hard feelings. Well, there are hard feelings, because I've had business owners tell me that, we got in this professional, listen to him. Usually it's a him, very rarely
yes.
listen to him, invested a lot in what he told us to do, and then one day he found another job and he just upped and left, and look at me, I'm now stuck here with his strategy, which the incumbent, the new person, is going to completely change. So, firing a family member may be very difficult, but letting go of or a professional leaving also brings some amount of heartache with to the family members as well.
Of course. But that comes back, I would say that comes back to key man risk. And that's true if you have a CEO for one of your companies and he decides to leave and change jobs, puts you in exactly the same position. But it is essentially still a business transaction there, underneath everything. And one of the things I would certainly caution people to do when they are looking for a family advisor, take a look at the depth of experience and to have a think about the cultural fit as well, by which I don't mean nationality or background, but by which I mean an individual who is looking to build something with your family for the long term as well, and ask questions that are pertinent to that.
Yeah, no, that's I think very, very good advice. Another bit of advice from you. What are some of the things that you would suggest to a patriarch who is serious about succession planning? What are some of the things, or a patriarch or a matriarch, what are some of the things that he or she should do to ensure that the process itself is seamless?
That is a great.
We tend to blame the younger generation for all our problems, but I think it is incumbent upon the older generation to make succession planning a seamless process. So what advice would you give?
Well, I think that's a great question, and one that I wish we had another hour to discuss, quite frankly. First thing, I absolutely agree, it is incumbent on the older generation. It's incumbent, I'll hesitate to use the word older generation, it's incumbent on the owners to build the succession plan. If you are the owner of the wealth, then you are the one who is responsible for the succession of the ownership and the wealth that is implied, therefore. And it is in your interests to bring the next generation along with you in that plan. It is very hard to impose a plan from the grave, even though there are certainly individuals who will try to do so. And trying to impose a plan from the grave will probably lead to heartache, will likely lead to conflict, which will have negative impacts on the business and the preservation of the wealth going forward. Starting with your question, what are the steps to take? It is a process. I would say the first step of the process is defining the relationship with the wealth. What's the point of the wealth? What's the purpose of the wealth? What do I want it to do? Do I want to use it up in the next 10 years? Do I want it to last for 3 generations? What good do I want my family to take from this? What's the legacy that I want to leave, both within my family, but also around the community, the town, and the world at large, in some cases? What impact will my wealth have? So starting from there, I think the next step is defining what people often call a mission and a value statement and so on. And that can be a very helpful tool in bringing the family together as well. So we're all on the same page. We understand why we're here as a family in some senses. Once we've done that, I think what's very helpful is then putting the rules in place. As I talked about, the rules of the game. What's the Constitution? The Constitution is usually a non-legally binding document, but it will outline how decisions are made, for example, consensus voting, etc. What types of boards and committees that will make decisions for different aspects of the wealth, what roles individual family members will have, how they will achieve those goals, what criteria they may need to meet, whether those roles will be revolving, how they will be measured, and so on and so forth. And then the third step is now really getting into the nitty-gritty. How are we going to run all this? And there, I think we have to start by taking a snapshot of the wealth. And that's actually something that not many people have necessarily done. That's something that we in my organization spend a fair amount of time helping people to do, is take that snapshot. Assets may be spread across different companies, maybe in different jurisdictions, maybe under different ownership structures. So taking a look at the big picture and then understanding what the end goal should be in terms of the wealth and what steps we need to take to get there. And that might include, for example, an asset allocation strategy. It might include tax and legal planning. It might include philanthropy. It might include a number of different aspects that will need to be tweaked. And there you really, I think, need to start getting serious about who your professional team is going to be around you. In the old days, not really very old days, but let's say 20 years ago, it was relatively easy to bring someone in, perhaps from the business, a trusted right-hand man, the accountant from the business, and so on, to start running these types of things. But as assets become more global, more complex, the legal ramifications and regulatory ramifications have become more and more complicated. And it becomes important to bring in professional advice so you are ticking all the boxes in the right way. An example is buying art. You mentioned buying art. Sounds great. I buy it somewhere, I put it somewhere. Surely that's all I do. Surely if there's a tax bill, they'll give it to me when I buy it. Not the case. If you buy art on Bond Street and you happen to keep it in the UK, but not in a bonded warehouse and in your pied-à-terre, in your apartment, you might have some tax implications down the road, even if you're not resident in the UK, perhaps. There are layers and layers that need to be considered. So we're going from the top level, essentially, the strategic purpose of the wealth, the construction of the family roles and rules and outcomes that we're hoping for, and then the tactical steps that need to be taken to manage the wealth. Sometimes you might build a family office to do it. Sometimes you might work with a multi-family office. And sometimes you will pull together what I call a virtual family office, which is really pulling together the experts in different areas, whether that's governance, tax, legal planning, accounting, obviously investments, and pulling together a project team that will work towards your goals as well. The last thing I'll mention is who in the family is going to run all this. And that's something to think about fairly carefully as well. Are you going to have a family member oversee this process, which will take some time? This is not a 6-month job or a 1-year job or really a 2-year job. It's an ongoing mission. So who in the family will oversee it, or will you bring in a professional to oversee it from beginning to end as well, and where you will find that professional as well. So
yeah, yeah, yeah. So Kripa, actually, whenever we talk of succession planning, you've defined a host of attributes that are the non-obvious one, because the obvious one is who's going to run the business. That is the only thing that comes to mind when anybody talks of succession planning. So most of the conversations are around an inheritor who is a willing inheritor, who does want to run the business. What kind of a succession planning can patriarchs do for an unwilling inheritor? Somebody whose interests are completely at variance from the family business. I mean, he or she likes wealth, but has no interest and has articulated it to all and sundry that he or she does not want to do anything to do with the business. What kind of a succession planning uh, can happen, and how do you prepare the patriarch to go and do what you advise him to do?
I would say advice has to come very gently.
To the
I'm
inheritor,
sure
or
the
to the
patriarch is very aware of the situation in this case and is fully aware that the intended successor to the business is not interested. And the first step is acceptance. He or she has to at some point, no, I'll take that back. He doesn't have to, but it is possibly in his best interest and the best interest of the business to accept that decision. So in the best interest of the family relationship and the best interest of the business future as well. Once that decision has been accepted, the succession planning actually becomes much easier. The first step is the hardest. Then we start looking at the succession plan and start putting criteria around the goals of the inheritor of the business. Do they need to be a family member? What technical or other skills do they need to have, experience, and so on? Do we spread it out further? So instead of being employee owners, should family members simply be owners, responsible owners and active owners, but not employee owners? And should the running of the business on a day-to-day business from CEO down be put into the hands of outside professionals, so that there are seats for the family on the board of the operating business, but not necessarily, as I said, on a day-to-day aspect. So these are all decisions that need to be made, but as I said, the first step is the most difficult. And if there is no acceptance, then I'm very sorry to say that I've seen cases where the family relationship has indeed been damaged severely, and the business has dissipated because there is no leadership at some point.
Yeah. But when you talk about leadership and even an unwilling inheritor being an owner and not an employee owner, the question that gets asked is, I am not interested in the business. I don't know anything about the business. Why does my father want me to be part of the board? What value will I add? I don't know anything about it. So again, your experience, if you did meet such an unwilling inheritor, how would you gently advise him? What is it that you'd say to him that would make sense?
I would say the first step is, if you are the owner of an asset, whatever that asset is, it is your responsibility to know something about that asset. If you do not wish to be an owner of that asset, that's a different conversation. And then you need to talk about an exit strategy, possibly a sale of the business, so that you can take your pot of cash, whatever it might be, and separate yourself completely. It's a very difficult conversation to have. It's a very painful conversation to have. But those are the two most common routes. So either, I think, an acceptance that if you own an asset, well, doesn't matter what the asset is, really. It can be a business. It can be a multi-billion-dollar business expanding several countries. It can be a car. It can be $50 in my wallet. I'm the owner of that asset, and I need to have some responsibility for that asset. It's as simple as that, unfortunately. And if not, you need to find a way to exit the ownership of that strategy, of that asset.
Yeah. So I think the word that you used, I think, is the key word: responsibility. You cannot have the benefits of the assets without also owning the responsibility for that asset. Talking of responsibility, I think you and I have a responsibility. Our time is running out.
Yes.
So we need to do a quick check on the time. And if there are any questions that anyone has, of either of us, then happy to answer that.
So, hey Sono. So I think we have one question from Great there. I think we touched on a lot of these aspects. So he's asking, of course, what form of succession planning do generally businesses take, and where do they really start? For example, what are the main reasons that you have seen for succession planning? Is it the companies are going for an IPO, the reason for asset and power? Is it the reason for the riskability of the families and then protect the wealth? And is it the one really wants to exit the business?
Yeah, I think Kripa's touched upon that in various answers.
Correct.
So if there are no other questions, then should we call it a wrap?
Yeah, I think I'll, we still have one more.
Before you do that, I do need to have my closing comments.
Yes, I would like both of you to have some final thoughts on. No, first of all, these are really great insights on for the families on how to start thinking about the succession. I think the time is never right to think about this concept, and it's very paramount for the families to think through this. So I'm happy, your final thoughts on for the families who are attending today, both Kripa and Son.
No, so my final thoughts are that succession planning is really not an event, it's a process. There's no switch that you can turn on and off and say succession planning is done and the light bulb kind of lights up. There are many facets involved, and the presence of an external party in whichever form is always useful, because then there is a non-judgmental expert who also knows how it's done in different other ways. Kripa's actually spent a lot of time talking about her experiences, and I do want to thank her for her really candid insights. And Kripa, it was a pleasure to have this conversation with you. I myself learned a lot from your conversation, from what you spoke. And Kiran, this was a lovely platform. And for all those logged in, thank you for being here. And I do hope that you got your time's worth. And we are always happy. I'm on LinkedIn, and I'm sure Kripa is. I know that Kiran is happy to interact with you and engage in any conversation that you may want. So thank you, Kripa, and thank you, Kiran.
You're most
thank you both.
Thank you. Kripa, your final thoughts.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I will keep it short in the interest of time, but I will say, first of all, certainly thank you to both of you for hosting this, and also thank you to the audience. I appreciate your time. There's no doubt that the current crisis has changed the world, but has also presented a lot of opportunities for us. And I would encourage anyone who has this in the back of their mind to grab the opportunity now and start thinking actively about the succession plan. Start thinking about the relationship with the wealth, what the point is, and to move forward and put those building blocks in place. It is very easy to get caught up in day-to-day activities. it's often a lot more fun as well, quite frankly. It's a lot more fun, I often find, to be making the money rather than thinking about how to protect the money going forward. But investing that time and effort into those building blocks will pay great rewards down the line, both for the family relationship and for the health of the business and the wealth going forward. And yes, I am on LinkedIn and happy to continue the chat with anyone at any time.
Absolutely. Great. Thanks. And thanks, Sonu and Kripa, for your valuable insights and very practical insights there. And thanks everyone who has joined us from across the globe today. I know I wish you a great evening if you're in India, and have a very good weekend as well. Thanks once again.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye, Kripa.
Bye. Bye, all. Bye-bye.
Bye.